It's entirely possible that there's no character in the Bible who gets more undeserved positive press than Gideon. There are a group of people who hand out Bibles bearing his name. There are people who test every decision by putting a fleece before the Lord like Gideon did. And of course there are all those Sunday school lessons about his unshakable trust in God. Sometimes I wonder if we're reading the same Bible. In my opinion, Gideon is a flawed hero at best. At worst, he might not be much better than some of the villains he attacks. But let's take a close look at his story, and you can make up your minds for yourselves. The story of Gideon begins with those familiar lines, "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord." Once again, God delivers them into the hands of an oppressor. This time, it's the Midianites, teamed up with the Amalekites to make Israel's life miserable. Both of these groups tended toward nomadic lifestyles, and now they're adding banditry to their resume. When Israel cried out to the Lord, God wasn't as quick to answer as he had been in the past. God sent a prophet to remind the people of how they had failed to keep their covenant relationship with him by choosing to worship the gods of their neighbors. But, in spite of his reluctance, God chose to send them a rescuer anyway. Gideon is the man that God has chosen. He's the son of a man named Joash, who apparently wasn't a person of any renown. In fact, when the angel tells Gideon that he's to deliver Israel, Gideon says that his clan is, quote, the weakest in the tribe of Manasseh, and he adds that he's the smallest one of the family. This is often the kind of talk we hear when someone is called by the Lord. Moses, Saul, David, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all of them argued that they were unfit to do God's work. But in Gideon's case, we seem to have some evidence to support his claim. Because when the angel appears, Gideon is threshing his grain in his wine press, so it won't be stolen by the Midianites. This is a really comical scene, but the humor is kind of lost on modern audiences. Threshing floors were typically located on a hill or an elevation out in open places. The harvesters would allow the sheaves to dry in the sun, and then they beat them with sticks to break up the stems and separate some of the grain. After the stalks have been beaten, the farmer takes his winnowing fork, and he begins to throw big forkfuls way up high into the air. The wind blows away the bits of the chaff, the broken stalks and leaves, while the kernels of grain fall down to the threshing floor. That's how you separate your wheat from the chaff. But Gideon is trying to winnow his grain in his wine press so that it won't be stolen by the Midianites. He doesn't want them to see him throwing it up into the air. Now, here's the thing. A wine press was cut into the ground, forming a depression below the surface of the land. Often they were covered with some kind of roof to provide shade for the workers, and they might even be located inside a cave. In any event, a wine press was a completely unlikely place for threshing grain because you couldn't get a breeze inside. Gideon was going to be getting a lot of roughage in his bread. So here's our hero, hiding his grain from the raiders, when this angel appears and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Can we say irony? Gideon answers the angel with a little speech that really sort of sums up some important theological concerns. First, if the Lord is really with us, then why haven't we seen those kinds of miracles that our ancestors told us about? Why does it seem that God isn't working these days? And more importantly, why are we being oppressed now by the Midianites? God defeated the Egyptians to bring us out of Egypt. Surely he can handle the Midianites if he's really on our side. The angel answers Gideon, "Well, God is going to do something now, and he's going to use you to do it." Which doesn't exactly comfort Gideon. Gideon wants proof that he's really called by God. Now, to some of us that might sound reasonable, but think about this. Did Moses demand proof that he was called? I mean, he fought God's call, but did he say, well, you've got to prove that you're really God? Did Saul demand proof? Did Jeremiah demand proof? They protested, but they didn't require God to prove himself. Well, God provided Gideon with his evidence, miraculously consuming an offering and then ascending upward into heaven in the smoke. And Gideon's response? Well, he's afraid. He's afraid that he's going to die because he's seen the angel of God. Obviously, this isn't a very rational fear. Why would God have told him he was going to deliver Israel if he intended to kill him? But even so, God comforts our hero. He assures him that he isn't going to die just yet. This idea of fearfulness is going to pervade the entire story of Gideon. It's a motif, binding together the entire episode, exhibited both by our hero and by all the other human characters here at one time or another. In fact, this motif recurs in the very next episode. God commands Gideon to tear down the pagan altar at his father's house. But Gideon is afraid to do so. He doesn't want to do it during the day when he might be seen, so he does it at night under the cover of darkness. Now, of course, we understand why Gideon was afraid when the townspeople discover that their idols are destroyed, because they want to kill the man who did it. But Joash makes the observation that if Baal is really a god, then he should be able to protect himself. Which is also somewhat ironic because it implies that Gideon should have known that God would have been able to protect him from the mob. Now when the Midianites and Amalekites crossed the Jordan River over into Israelite territory, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he rallied several of the tribes of Israelites to himself. But once those forces had mustered, Gideon again had his misgivings. Now comes his famous fleece. God, if you have really called me, then prove it. I'll put this fleece on the threshing floor, and in the morning, if the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, then I'll believe that you sent me. In a way, Gideon's fleece is sort of like Barak's insistence that Deborah go with him into battle. If God fails, then Gideon is off the hook. But God answers in the affirmative, and Gideon is still unconvinced. Once again, he asks for the fleece test, but this time he wants the ground to be wet while the fleece is dry. So this is the third time Gideon has requested that God prove himself to him, that he's really supposed to deliver Israel. It seems as if Gideon is hoping that God is going to fail. But once again, God confirms his call. Gideon is stuck. When Gideon sees his army of Israel all assembled, he's probably worried. His troops number about 32,000, while the enemies are an uncountable host. But then God says, Gideon, you've got too many men. Tell anybody who's afraid, that they can go home. So Gideon does so, and what happens? 2/3 of his men leave. Obviously, there's a lot of fear going on here. We can probably figure that Gideon is probably really concerned too, but the text doesn't say so. I can imagine that he probably was envying those people who were on their way back home at this point. But the text simply says that God told Gideon, you still have too many men. Take them all down to the river to get a drink. Anybody who laps like a dog from his hands is to be sent home. Anyone who kneels to drink can go out to fight. Now, there's been a lot of speculating on the nature of this criterion, why people who knelt to drink made better soldiers or something of that sort. But, as a number of commentators have noted, it's not really about selecting the best soldiers. If God wanted a good army, it would certainly have been better to keep as many soldiers as possible. Now, the primary significance of this test is that it weeded out a lot of men. But on the other hand, it is possible that there is some reason behind this particular method. Men who would kneel down to drink weren't afraid of putting themselves in a vulnerable position, while the men who remain standing while they drink from their cupped hands are possibly still on guard. Anyway, this is how Gideon's 30,000 men gets whittled down to 300, a ridiculously small army. At night, God tells Gideon that if he is still afraid, he can go down and spy in the enemy camp. Of course Gideon goes and spies. Of course he's still afraid. And he overhears men talking, revealing that the enemy is more afraid of Gideon than he is of them. At this point, Gideon begins to change. He follows the Lord's instructions, supplying each man in his army with a trumpet and a torch concealed under a vase. When his men have surrounded the Midianite camp, Gideon gives a cry, and the men shatter their vases and blow their trumpets. The sudden light and sound causes the Midianites to be thrown into confusion. They fight against each other, slaughtering most of their own men. Israel has already won a great victory through the use of fear. But of course, the story isn't over yet. Israelites from the countryside come out to finish off the Midianite army, while Gideon and his elite force of 300 go in pursuit of the enemy generals. As Gideon is pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, two of the most notorious Midianite chiefs, he stops at the Israelite city of Sukkoth, and he asks the people there for supplies. But the people of Sukkoth refuse, because they're afraid that Gideon might not be able to catch the generals, and the generals would be angry with them and take out wrath upon them. Now we begin to see just what kind of man Gideon is becoming. "When I return this way," he says, "I'll flay you with thorns and briars." Then Gideon went on to Peniel, and he made the same request. But the people of Peniel also refuse him. So Gideon tells them that when he returns, he's going to tear down their city tower. Once Zebah and Zalmunna are captured, Gideon returns to those cities, flaying the people of Sukkoth alive and killing the men of Peniel. The theme of fear arises again as Gideon passes judgment on Zebah and Zalmunna. When he finds out that these generals had killed his brothers, Gideon decides that they must die. Once again, it seems that our hero is carrying out a bit of a personal vendetta. He orders his oldest son to do the deed, to kill the generals, but the boy wouldn't do it because he was afraid. So Gideon killed the men himself, no longer fearful. Gideon's journey to the dark side is almost complete. He's gone from a fearful, reluctant farmer to being leader and judge of Israel. He refuses to be made king, but he is going to establish a dynasty of judges, with his sons taking the office after him. He's gone from tearing down a pagan altar to tearing down a tower in an Israelite city. But he's got one more surprise up his sleeve. With gold from the plunder of the Midianites, Gideon makes an ephod. What is an ephod? Well, it was a garment worn by the high priest in Israel, which was apparently used in the divination rituals of the Israelites. Now Gideon, he didn't wear the ephod himself. What he did was he set it up in his hometown. This was a man who was always demanding a sign from the Lord, and now he has a way of getting a sign whenever he wants one. But the greater irony was that all the Israelites came and worshipped the ephod that Gideon had made. How could such a thing happen? While it might be difficult for us to imagine worshipping a garment, clothes were often closely associated in the ancient world with the deities that they covered. The ephod was apparently treated as some kind of a garment for the Lord, so the Israelites viewed it as an extension of the Lord. It wasn't exactly like worshipping a pagan god, but it was worshipping a graven image. And God has some very harsh words against idolatry in any form. Gideon had delivered the people from one form of oppression, but he had led them into another form, the oppression of idol worship. So was Gideon the unalloyed hero that some people make him out to be? Obviously not. But he was chosen by God to deliver his nation, and in spite of his misgivings, he was obedient to God's call. In the dark days of Israel's judges, that might be the best that we can hope for.